Can knowing how the brain works help you learn and remember better? Absolutely! In this video, we will look at the neuroscience of memory and what learning strategies it tells us are effective. So stay tuned to find out how to learn more using the neuroscience of memory. Let's begin by looking at the basic building blocks of our memory, neurons. Neurons are specialized cells that transmit information using electrical and chemical signals. The central part of a neuron is called the cell body. Off of the cell body are the dendrites. The dendrites are where the neuron receives signals from other neurons. Also coming out of the cell body, but much longer, is the axon. The axon carries electric signals from the cell body towards the axon terminals. The job of the axon terminals is to pass the signal along to the dendrites of other neurons. To recap, when a neuron is activated, an electric signal travels down the neuron, along the axon, to the ends of the axon terminals. Then, using neurotransmitters, the signal is passed to the next neuron through the synaptic gap. This process is repeated through a connected chain of neurons. And this is what's happening in your brain when you are recalling information. That is, learning is about creating and strengthening chains of neurons. How easily you remember and use information is dependent on how strongly connected the neurons are. Let's look at this using my favorite analogy of lost cities in a jungle. In doing so, I will show you some effective strategies and give you a sense of why they are effective. When you first learn something, your neurons start forming a pathway that encodes the information. It is unlikely that you will learn a new concept perfectly the first time you see it, so you will probably need to review it at least a couple of times to make the pathway stronger. However, remember, the goal is to not just get information into your brain, you want to make sure that you can get the information back out. The reason why just rereading your notes is not effective is that it is only building a one-way path. In fact, when you reread something you already know, your brain generally just pulls out its map and says, "Yeah, I know how to get there," and doesn't even bother walking the path. Have you ever studied something a lot, but then couldn't remember it for a test? This could be what happened. You just built a one-way street. So you need to build a two-way street. That is, you need to try to recall the information from memory. Make sure that you can get the information out. This method, called retrieval practice, is known to be very effective at building strong pathways. One great example of retrieval practice is a memory dump. That is, closing all of your notes, taking out a blank piece of paper, and writing down everything you can think of. This will really show you what parts you know and what you still need to review. Of course, if the path isn't used for a long time, then the jungle will start to reclaim it. If you don't use it, you will lose it. How quickly the jungle takes over will depend on how well developed the path was in the first place. This is why studying several times a week is so much better than studying just once a week. If you wait a week between study sessions, then it will be difficult to walk the path again. That is, lots of effort goes into relearning what you forgot. On the other hand, once you have a good pathway, then even a very quick retrieval a few times a week will not only ensure that the pathway remains open, but it will make the path faster and faster. Let's look at what is happening inside the brain. If a neuron is fired regularly, then the brain spends some of its resources to insulate the axon. This insulation is called the myelin sheath. This insulation makes the electric signal much faster and more reliable. The more you practice, the thicker the myelin sheath gets and the more reliable and faster the signal becomes. In fact, this insulation can increase the speed by up to 100 times. This is how athletes can get such fast reflexes. Through regular practice, they have built up super thick insulation on those pathways. Neuroscience tells us that studying a subject 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, is much better than studying for 8 hours straight just once a week. This is why things like long study sessions and cramming are ineffective for long-term learning. Your brain simply cannot learn that much at one time. And what it did learn, it will probably just forget quickly due to it not being used again. Before we look at the other aspect of effective learning, we quickly review the 3-step process for building a strong pathway. First, you need to build the initial pathway. This is done through the deep processing of the information. Remember, it can take a couple of study sessions to lay a good initial path. Next, use retrieval practice to ensure that you can recall and use the information. Finally, strengthen the pathway using deliberate practice. The other aspect of effective learning is to create large, well-connected networks of information. Trying to learn these individually is not only difficult, but it means that you will have too many paths to remember, so you end up with lots of overgrown trails. Instead, you should try to build upon your existing knowledge and to connect the information to form one big chunk. This makes it both easier to remember all of the information, but also to use the information together. Of course, if you don't access this information for a long time, then the pathway to it can disappear. However, the information is still in your brain. You just need to get to it again. That is, it's like riding a bike. You initially don't remember, but with a little effort, it suddenly all comes back to you. This happens to me sometimes with song lyrics. I have to look up the first line of the song, but once I get that, I can remember the entire song. Throw in the comments a time where just one clue has helped you remember a ton of information. This is how analogies and mnemonics work. If you can remember the analogy, then you get access to a ton of information from that. To take this to the next level, we find another related chunk of information in our brain and combine them together to form an even bigger chunk. This has many advantages. For example, if you have separate networks and lose access to one, you will have trouble recalling that information. But if they are connected, then losing one pathway doesn't hurt. Your brain will still be able to find a path to any piece of information that you need. To aid you in doing that, we can use the AID method. A is for analogize. That is, try to come up with an analogy for the concept. An analogy, like a mnemonic, connects the information to something you are familiar with to help you remember it. I is for investigate. Try to determine the why and the how of the material. Think about in what context the information could be applied and in what context it could not be applied. Lastly, D is for doodle. When learning new material, try to connect the new information to what you already know by making simple diagrams, drawings, flowcharts, timelines, etc. Using AID will help you develop large chunks. This will make your learning more efficient and durable. By understanding how the brain works, we can see why it is so important to connect new information with your existing knowledge and to practice over many different days. Using these strategies, you will learn faster and forget slower. I hope you have enjoyed this video. To learn more, watch these other informative videos. Thanks for watching.